Okay, so welcome everyone. Again, my name is Kayla Cullum, and tonight we're talking about the MD-PhD programs through the application process. I will be monitoring the chat throughout, so if you have questions, please put it in the chat. But I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Terry Rogers, who's going to give us a little presentation for a minute or two, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists tonight. So, Dr. Rogers.
Good evening, everybody. Let me see if I can get this back to the beginning. So this evening, we're really going to focus on the application process for the MD-PhD programs, which for the folks entering the next cycle should be beginning just about now. So it is tailor-made really to focus on those people that are entering the next cycle for applications. However, we've been encouraging everyone to attend. And I also encourage everyone to ask questions as well, because it's helpful for freshmen and sophomores, juniors, even seniors who are doing a gap year or two to be thinking about this as well. But certainly it's tailor-made for those that are just embarking on this exciting journey of applying to MD-PhD programs. So please feel free to ask questions through the chat while I'm speaking, and I'll be happy to, through Kayla, go ahead and address those questions. My goal here is to spend about 20 minutes outlining some of the nuts and bolts details of what we need to be doing, starting from now right on through next April and May. And then once I finish up, well, I'll turn this over to our MD-PhD applicant panel, who have just been undergoing the gauntlet this year and will share their wisdom with us at that time. So there'll be plenty of time for questions with them as well. That's a main part of this workshop today. So let's look at the statistics in terms of MD-PhD-dom out there. And this year, the AAMC numbers are that in medical school, we had 96,520 enrollees. And of them, exactly 6,005 are MD-PhD students. And as you can see here, somewhat more men than women overall. Now, keep in mind, these are spread over about an 8-year program, and the medical school part is just the 4-year piece. So that most of these numbers, but not all of them, are embedded in here. We look at the enrollment for this past year. These would be then the freshman medical students. There's some 23,000 freshman medical students in this country. And of that 23,000, 709 are MD-PhDs. So it's a pretty rarefied group. There are more women than men. And this is, I think, the 3rd year in a row now where the women have exceeded the 50 percentile ranking. 50% ranking, and this year it's even continued to increase. So good going, ladies. We see that more. And this is a trend that we've seen in all the professional schools as well. And this is the breakdown in terms of their description of their race. These are all self-described on the AMCAS primary application, but this just shows you the distribution by race. And I will note here that 21 of the 709 were international students. So if we have any international students tonight, we can talk about that. We've had good success at Hopkins getting our international applicants into programs, but it is tough, or at least a higher bar than our normal MD-PhD applicants. In terms of the statistics, in terms of the applicant pool for this past cycle that generated the freshman class this year, there were a total of 1,793 applicants to MD-PhD programs. That's down a little bit. It's been around 1,800. I think last year it was around 2,000. So this was a number that was a bit down. And as we said, generated 709 matriculants. These are the mean MCATs. Notice the range and GPA of the applicant pool. And here are the matriculants. You can see the mean is around 516 for the MCATs, which is what I think about a 95th percentile. I forget exactly the numbers. They vary a little bit from year to year. And the GPA for matriculants is about 3.82. I do draw your attention to the fact there is a large range here in matriculants. 528 is perfect score, but you see somewhat way down in the 490 range. So what that tells us is that NIA actually, when I was director at Maryland, I accepted some students that were in the lower ranges here who were exceptionally talented, good academically, great researchers, had great GPAs, but were lousy standardized test takers, for example. I had one woman in particular who was down in this range and ended up as a straight A student publishing top journals and is a very successful physician scientist now. So we do look at the whole applicant, and I think this range here does reflect that. I'll come back to talking about what you need to be thinking about in MCATs as an applicant moving forward in a few minutes. So in terms of our program here, undergraduates, this is taken from the internal numbers that were generated. Their applicant numbers range in the upper 30s to 34, 39, as you can see. Matriculants in the high 20s. This is a really good number. This puts Hopkins right up at the top of the country in terms of matriculating students. And unlike the national average, which is around 38% matriculation rate for applicants, we're at about double that. This is what, 75, 78%. So Hopkins is doing very well in terms of getting our students into MD-PhD programs around the country.
Dr. Rogers, going back to your, not the last data slide, but the previous one, I have a question from a student. Are there standard deviations for this data?
I didn't, these are published by AAMC and they just publish the mean. They don't get this, they don't publish, but you can go and look. There may be another tables, but typically they just look at the mean score. But it's a pretty narrow range for the MCATs. I think it's a bell-shaped curve, but it's pretty narrow. Okay, as we embark on the MD-PhD application process, I think it's really important to consider what are the programs and program directors and admissions committees looking for in terms of applicants. And just to highlight them, they're looking for applicants with integrity and maturity who show concern for others, potentials for leadership, and an aptitude for working with others. Got to be team players, got to be a team leader. These are going to be attributes that you will exploit in your careers. Research experiences, and we'll talk a lot about that today. They're absolutely a critical piece of the application process. The academic record, in terms of the MCAT scores, GPAs, I just gave you the numbers nationally, they're important. And a personal statement, which is one of the 3 essays that you have to generate for the application, primary application. Why do you want to be an MD-PhD? What is it that motivates you? Why not just do medical school? Why not just get a PhD? Letters of recommendation from research mentors are critical. Experience in caring for others is a very, along with extracurricular activities and life experiences are sort of another leg to the stool, if you will, 3-legged stool. So experiences, extracurricular activities also important. And I think that the latter 2 areas show evidence of success in multitasking. And a number of directors will tell you this. They look for students who are energetic, can handle different activities, jump from one area to another, because this is sort of the life of a physician scientist. Multitasking is what it's all about. So broadly, in terms of the application timeline, what you should be thinking about if you're entering this cycle right now, it sort of becomes like a toboggan run, right? Once you start and you start heading down the hill, it just picks up speed. There's nowhere to get off until the end. But the application, you have already submitted your HPA here to internally to the office. Application for the AMCAS primary in June through August, the year before entry. And we encourage this to be early, the June. The portal opens, is it late May this year? Kayla, do you remember?
Yeah, it's early May, and then you can submit late May, and then med schools will get your applications late June.
So we really encourage that early. And then you're going to be getting over the summer secondary applications from the 20 or some odd schools you've applied to. You'll be assembling your letters of recommendation from your research mentors and other folks. So all this takes some time, and so keep in mind in the May, June, early July timeline, you're going to be busy doing these kinds of things. Interviews typically take place at programs in the September to February timeframe, and the office does offer mock interviews for those that have been invited for interviews along the way. Final decisions, acceptances will occur in the November to March timeframe. Revisit programs in the March to April, process complete in April and May. And typically programs will start anywhere from June. Some programs want students to pre-matriculate into the summertime before medical school starts in August. So that's broadly the timeline. But in terms of the primary application, primary MCAS application, you apply early. And that's repeated multiple times just to emphasize that. I cannot emphasize that enough. Keep in mind, all programs are going to get more applications, qualified applicants, than they can ever interview. I know at Maryland, for example, we have around 220 applicants a year for about 11 slots. And we interview maybe 40 to 50 folks out of the 220 for those 11 to 12 slots. And so an application that arrives on our desk in September, that looks really qualified and exciting, will be invited for an interview. If that same application arrives on our desk right at the deadline in November, may not be invited because all our slots are already filled. So that's why applying early is so critical, absolutely critical for your outcomes and for options along the way. We encourage you to apply to at least 20 schools. And keep in mind that when you get this application in, it takes a finite amount of time for AMCAS to process it. Your transcripts, which you have to fill out, are then verified, applicant by applicant, going back to the registrars of the various schools so that it's verified. So once it's sent out to the MD-PhD programs, it's been verified along the way. MCAT scores are also necessary for the application to move forward. Most programs won't even look at your application until the MCAT scores are in, so make sure that's all done early as well. We're talking about MCATs, and I just mentioned that this is the old scoring numbers, and this is the one year we got AAMC to do some calculations, but I think it's basically true. So what I've done here is I've binned the scores, and now I've transformed the old MCAT numbers into what is analogous now for MCAT scores. And the point is, if you're in the 502 to 505 range, about, I would say 9% of the applicants are successful in matriculation. If you go slightly higher, that number triples, so 27%. And then as you can see, we go up to like the 511, 516, you're up over 50%. And so one of the questions that I get sometimes from students who are applying is, gee, if I have a 507, should I retake the MCATs? And the answer is, well, if you think you could get up into this range from your efforts, well, yes, you should. It's worth, you're going to double your chances, basically. So just keep that in mind as well, that applicants do matriculate from these areas, but it's always better to increase your retake that if you think you can increase your scores. So that's worth making an investment. I wish that we could get MCAS to do these numbers now, but we were lucky back then. We had more leverage. Okay, so that's about what I'll say about MCATs. Activities, you have to fill out the activities in the primary, and that's really important as well. So research, extracurricular, anything in terms of leadership, any clubs that you're on, if you were the vice president or the treasurer or president of your fraternity, for example, any awards, manuscripts submitted, you're involved with music groups or orchestras, singing, athletics, if you're on a team, you want to know about that. Community service, anything that's interesting about you, any of the activities that you've been doing in addition to research and to your academic coursework is really important. Makes you an interesting person. Keep in mind that your application should be telling a story, and the directors and the admissions committees look at your application as a story, not just a bunch of boxes that have been filled in. And interesting people who are energetic, excited about their future, optimistic about what they've been doing, do very well in the admissions process. Now, there are the 3 essays that are required in the MCAS primary: the personal statement, which is what all medical school applicants fill out. In this personal statement, what drives you? What kind of clinical experiences have you had? What motivates you to do the MD as well as the MD-PhD? And then secondly, there's a shorter essay, why MD-PhD? This is really important. Why do you want to do this? And I think importantly, you should tell the admissions committees what you know about this career and how you know it's for you. Role models, physician scientists, role models you've interacted with, both in the clinic and in the laboratories, is really valuable here. And basically, you should convey the notion of why an MD-only degree will not work for you. I think that's what the core of that essay should be about. And then there's the famous research experiences essay. This is the most in red because it's the most important component of the application. And it is in 10,000 characters. Tell us about your research experiences. So research experiences essay, this is the critical component. So let's talk about this in detail. What I think the best way to organize the research experiences is to list them chronologically from the earliest to the latest, and list each research experience separately with a heading, what lab you were in, the PI, the duration, for example, June 1 to August 26, 2022, for example. And how much time did you spend? Well, in the summer, maybe 50 hours a week. If it's during the academic year, it's less than that, and we would expect that. But you need to quantify the actual research time invested. There are a number of reasons for doing that, but it helps highlight which are the most important research projects that you worked on. In each case, then after the heading, describe the hypotheses you tested and what experiments you actually did. So this essay should get away from the third person, the team concept. You know, we did this, we studied that, we decided the next step, because this is about you and your research potential. And so what experiments did you actually do within the framework of maybe larger experiments, larger hypotheses, with as much scientific detail as possible? These should be written as if it's going to be read and probably will be read by experts in the field. So this is not sort of cocktail party conversation or some article for the New York Times. This is something in detail with all kinds of scientific detail as much as space allows. What you actually did. State your discoveries again in detail. What did you discover and how did you interpret those discoveries? What did it mean in terms of the hypothesis? Did it solve the problems or did it create new problems? Did along the way in your experiments, did you encounter experimental blocks, things that didn't work? And how did you solve those blocks? How did you do troubleshooting? Troubleshooting experiments is really important. And ultimately, what did you learn from that experience? Did you take ownership of a part of this project? Did you drive it forward? Did you have some good ideas that you could suggest to your PI about next steps? The essay to convey enthusiasm and sophistication in science. Again, I hear directors will often say, reading these essays is like reading something written by one of the world's experts in this field. And what we look for in this chronological order is a growth and development of the applicant over the years in these experiences. What did they learn from it? And hopefully seeing increased sophistication in the questions that they asked and the experiments that they did. So research experiences, these 3 essays, and that's the most important. And we will offer reviews of drafts of your essay. So if you submit your essays to the office, I will have a chance to go over them and review, and I'll particularly focus on the research experiences essays. And I think that's very valuable. I found over the years that some are spot on perfect. Others need some work and some focus, and I'm happy to help all of you in that effort. Letters of recommendation, you should be collecting those. Letters from your research mentors are absolutely critical here. So the research mentor themselves is really important. And in addition, there might be some leader in the lab that you could get a letter from, but you need to have the PIs. They need to be front and center in any of these letters. So I mentioned you should be applying to about 20 schools. And so how do you decide of the some 100 programs in the country and the 45 to 50 MSTP programs in the country? How do you decide which ones should you apply to? Well, to address that, due diligence is essential. And there are a number of areas that are important, and I'll just quickly list them and then go over them. Research opportunities, programmatic issues, the quality metrics for the program, and some of the intangibles. So research opportunities, absolutely critical. If you're interested in engineering, biomedical engineering, the schools and the opportunities they offer in biomedical engineering research and training are critical. So don't apply to a school that doesn't offer a PhD in engineering. Programmatic issues. Oh, let me mention here, NIH Reporter is a database that you can, I give the link later, that you can log into at NIH, and it's a wonderful relational database, and you can do queries and searches for all funded projects that NIH funds in this country. And you can ask questions, for example, let's say you're interested in tumor immunology. You could ask a question, let's say you're interested in Penn. You could go in and under institution, select Penn, and then select under keywords, tumor immunology, and it will spit out all of the grants that are funded by NIH at Penn Medical School or in the main campus as well in tumor immunology. And you can then see the PIs involved, what their projects are, the abstracts. It's a really valuable way to figure out, well, what schools offer the things that I'm most interested in. So research opportunities, you need to really drill down and make sure that they are, the 20 schools reflect this, your interests. Programmatic issues. How integrated is the program? What's the medical school curriculum like? Is it changing? Is it a new, more modern curriculum? Is the MD-PhD program well integrated into the medical school program? The strength of the administration. What kind of directors do they have? What kind of support do they have in terms of administrators that provide support for the students? How about the list of mentors? How committed are they? The size of the program. Some are quite large, spread over a whole city and multiple hospitals along the way, and some are rather small and focused, and it really depends on what you're more comfortable with. Time to completion. How long does it take for the students to get done? 8 years should be it. You don't want to see a program where the students are 9, 10, 11 years in the program. That's a bad sign. And the quality of the PhD programs in the areas that you are seeking your training. And again, the NIH Reporter database here, you can go in and actually type in, again, if we go back to the Penn model, you could go to Penn and type in under activity type, training grants for graduate students. You say, spit out all the training grants in cancer research, cancer biology at Penn, and we'll list all of these training grants available, which tells you the strength of that school in terms of cancer training programs for graduate students. So you need to do some due diligence here as well. Quality metrics, I've mentioned before about medical scientist training programs. These are training grants funded by NIH to these schools that have good MD-PhD. And so you need to consider whether you're only going to apply MSTP. There's some really good non-MSTP schools as well. Quality metrics include the attrition rate, quality of the residency matches that the students have, the publication rate. I think that's really, really important. How well do the students publish? How many first author papers do they get? What are the quality of the journals that they're in, particularly in your area? Are there successful alumni? This will be valuable in networking, and also tells you that this program has a long history of excellent recruiting and training of MD-PhDs. And then there are the intangibles, which are in fact, the diversity of the program, quality of life issues. Do you like big cities? Well, New York could be exciting, Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Los Angeles. If you don't like big cities, then, other schools like UVA or Dartmouth or maybe Penn State Hershey, things of that sort. So you need to consider that in terms of the diversity of the program. Is it in a diverse environment or not? you have to think about, because you're going to be there in the decade of your 20s, which is a wonderful time. And so it's a have to be a place that and an environment that you find yourself welcomed in and excited about. And apply to a mix of schools. And I always encourage students, don't just apply to the top 10 schools only, apply to some that are less competitive, because you just never know from the other side how this is going to mix and match out. So make sure that you have within your 20 a range of competitiveness. I just mentioned here the list of, I did these over, can you see this? I don't know if this is blocking, but the matriculation of our students over 19, 20, 21, 3 years. This is the range of schools that they matriculated. And I want to emphasize, Hopkins was #1, Duke was 2, Case Western, Cornell, Tri-I, Northwestern, Maryland, Yale, Sinai. What's impressive is not only we have a lot of students matriculating, but they matriculate in really top schools. They have really great choices. And even the years preceding that, you can see Penn, WashU, Cornell. But I also want to point out something else. When we look at I didn't add up this number of matriculants over 3 years. It's probably around 80 to 90. They went to some 40 different schools. So that tells us, again, a lot of schools offer different things for different people. So look broadly, interview broadly, give it a good look. Don't narrow yourself down to, let's say, Harvard, Yale, Penn, and Cornell and be done with it. That's just not going to work well for you. How do you gather information? These are professional office. We include programs that accept international students, for example. NIH Reporter database. This is what is very valuable for you, both for the determination of the 20 schools as well as second visits. This is really valuable for that in terms of just seeing what's available at the different schools you visit. AAMC has an MD-PhD section where we offer a lot of information. American Physician Science Association, and then there is the MSTP website at NIH. So I will stop there, and if there are no questions pressing, I'll have a chance to answer them later. I'm happy to introduce our applicant panel. These are 2 students that are living, breathing applicants. I think they're still breathing, right? Is that the case? I see it looks like their vital signs look good. Tara Foley and Sarah Said, and they're just finishing up this exciting journey. So I assume you 2 have organized, cogent, and very well thought out brief introductions of what you want to say, and then we'll open it up for questions from our students. So I get on my screen, Tara, you're on top. Would you like to start?
Yes, I can start. So hi, I'm Tara Foley. I graduated from Hopkins in 2021. I studied biomedical engineering, and I applied this past cycle to MD and MD-PhD. Although I will be going to an MD program, it's research focused at the Cleveland Clinic, and I can kind of go more into that later.
Did you, how many schools did you interview with?
9.
9, okay. Well, I'm sure we'll ask more about that later. Okay, Sarah?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I recently just graduated from Hopkins in December 2022. Majored in neuroscience with a focus in cellular molecular neuroscience, and I also minored in art. And I also applied to a kind of mix of MD and MD-PhD programs, and I'll be going to the MD-PhD program at the University of Michigan in July.
And how many schools did you interview at?
I interviewed at, I had 14 interview offers, but I think I interviewed at 8.
8, okay. So you were pretty busy finishing up school and interviewing, huh? That's a
yeah, balancing the school and interviews was a bit tough, but it was all right.
And Tara, so you graduated a year early, so you did a so-called post-bac year or gap year, is that right?
Yeah, so I did, it'll be 2 gap years because I graduated in May of 2021.
And what did you do?
I worked as a laboratory technician at a neuroscience lab at the University of Maryland.
Oh, okay. At College Park?
No, in Baltimore.
Oh, okay. Whose lab?
His name was Stefan Wolf.
Okay, good.
He's a new PI. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe, well, we'll throw it for questions, but I maybe first, I don't know if either one of you went to any of my sessions ahead of time, but whether you did or not, were there any things that surprised you or were unexpected that you learned during the interview process, maybe going to out on interviews that were some, whoa, I didn't realize this and this. Anything you can share?
I guess one thing I kind of found, I guess, less intimidating than I initially thought of. I think the interviews, especially like the MD, PhD side of things, I think I anticipated that they'd be a lot more like, intensive on the research and like, grilling me on the research questions. But I think it's also just a blend of like a conversation about science. What do you think? Like, what are your ideas? What do you hope to, bring to the program? What are things that you want to do in the future? It's not so much like they're grilling you on the research, which we should know, but I think it's also a conversation. So that was, I guess, something that was nice to have in the interviews.
Tara, anything you might?
I think for me, it was how different, I guess, like the questions between MD, PhD and MD interviews were like projected. Like the kind of the themes of them were very different. Like obviously the MD, PhD is very heavily like research. And so like pretty much a lot of my interview questions were like somehow related to like research, investigative like qualities and such. And the fact that like some of the MD programs I interviewed at didn't seem to ask very relevant questions they didn't dive it quite as deep, which was surprising, I guess. I thought they would still ask some about research.
Okay, we have any questions there?
Yeah, we have one, and we kind of briefly touched on it, but when applying, would you recommend also applying to MD programs? And I mean, I know, Tara applied to both MD and MD PhD, so maybe both of you could talk about why you chose to apply to the places that you chose, whether it was MD, MD, PhD, or both, and navigate that for us.
Yes, so I can start. I curated, I think I applied to 29 schools, and I curated it pretty heavily on research interest. So I used the NIH reporter link to some degree, but also just the university's websites and parsed through PIs and what types of projects they were doing. And then further to decide if I wanted to apply to MD or MD PhD at a particular school. I looked at whether it was MSTP. I looked at, I usually did some research on like Student Doctor Network and Reddit. I do I do encourage you not to spend too much time on those sites because they can get they can make you a bit anxious, but they made me at least. But they were very helpful in like student life balance because I wasn't really interested in going to a program that completely consumed my life for 8 or 9 years. So that was something I considered as well. And then geographic location was very big for me. I wanted to be in a major city, preferably on like the East Coast, like eastern part of the country, because that's where I'm from.
And the
Yeah,
Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, right?
Sorry?
You want to be near the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Is
Yeah, that's really what's in it for me.
that-
I went along sort of a very similar line as Tara. I think I started with, research interests, while aligning those to the MD, PhD programs that I was applying to. The few MD programs that I was interested in as well, I think they were in, like, I live in Michigan, so there was a few like MD schools that I was interested in, just to stay in the state. But I think, again, the primary focus for me was also MD, PhD, and yeah.
I don't have any more questions in the chat right now, but if anyone has questions and you want to.
Maybe I can amplify. So when I was a director, and I'm speaking with other directors when I go to the national meetings, there was some concern that we had as directors for applicants who were applying MD only and MD-PhD for the following reason. I always tell this to students. I wouldn't know as somebody coming in, like if Tara came to interview with me, I wouldn't know whether you had applied MD only to some schools and MD-PhD to us. I wouldn't ask you. I don't never felt that was an appropriate question, nor I don't know if either one of you encountered anyone, and I used to beat on my admissions when you don't ask applicant where else they've applied. I mean, it's not, I don't know if any of you felt that, because it can be uncomfortable and it's not appropriate. But in any case, if we had an inkling that somebody was applying MD to some schools, and then we would tend to discount their application a little bit more, because we felt like, well, if they're willing to go MD only somewhere, how really committed are they to the dual degree pathway? And so, did you all encounter any of those kinds of concerns, or was that ever brought up or broached in any way?
Yeah, for me it was. So I had a few interviewers ask me, so not specifically where else I applied, but like general geographic areas that I applied, and or like a specific city. They're like, did you apply to any other schools in New York? And did you apply to only MD PhDs and only MDs? And for me, I did apply to majority MD PhDs, so that's what I just led with. I just said I applied to majority MD PhDs, and like that's strongly where my interest lies, and kind of left it at that. But personally, my answer is that it was really dependent on the research projects available and kind of the research curriculum, whether I was going to dedicate the extra time to do a PhD.
Sarah, did it come up in your interviews at all?
For me, I don't, to my knowledge, I don't think I remember anything about, why, like, in terms of like, why did you apply? Did you apply to any MD or MD PhD programs? I think my application was very research heavy. So I actually did not get any interviews from like the MD programs, the MD side of things. I usually got it from the MD PhD programs, because I think my application was just sort of geared towards the research side more.
Well, I'll be honest, sometimes my admissions committee, we would kind of get an inkling that somebody was applying to both when the personal statement was more like, didn't mention research at all or very much, and it was sort of like, I'm the second coming of Mother Teresa kind of thing, right? So it was all about clinical, and so it could go and fit right into a medical school application. And if we saw that, we usually got an inkling that whereas if somebody talked all in their personal statement that part of their person is research, and so they had to talk about it, we knew they were hooked and they were going to be going the dual degree pathway. But again, it was just an inkling, we didn't really know. And I think it's something that I think our students could consider. I just remember a close colleague of mine was the director at the Cornell Tri-I program, and he said to me, Terry, if we figure out that they're applying MD only somewhere, we're done with them. We're not even going to pursue them anymore. So it could be that, sort of narrow. But anyway, it's something for all of you all to consider as you put your application together and how you're going to deal with that.
Yeah, it's interesting, Dr. Rogers, that you said that, because when I was writing my personal statement, I didn't know how much research to put in it,
Right.
because I had heard similar opinions. And so I did mention research a bit, but it definitely it did swing both ways. So.
Yeah, because then you worry that, if I put in a lot of research, the MD programs aren't going to like me, right? Because they're going to figure I'm a research, I want to clone genes or something. I don't care about patients. And so, yeah, so it is a fine line to walk that way. So both of you had interviews for MD only programs as well as MD PhD?
I think Sarah said she didn't.
Yeah, I only had interviews for MD PhD programs.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question. So, what were your significant clinical experiences and how did they fit with your research interests? If they did.
So I can go that. So actually, part of the reason that I took 2 gap years instead of just one is because during COVID, I had a really difficult time getting clinical research experiences, as probably
Yeah.
many students did. So I had kind of unrelated clinical experiences in undergrad. Just like before COVID, I was working as in a design team as part of the BME program, and that was a significant clinical experience. I was able to shadow ENTs and interventional radiologists heavily, which was great. But my clinical experiences that were relevant to my research was after I graduated, and so I volunteered in a pediatric psych unit at the University of Maryland, and my research was in behavioral neuroscience, and that was a great way that I was able to tie the concepts together.
I think from my clinical experiences, I worked the patient transfer, and for similarly as Tara, I kind of had I struggled with finding clinical opportunities, especially during COVID. So I found the opportunity to be a patient transporter, and I really enjoyed that. But it wasn't exactly the most well aligned to my research interests. Because my research interest is more like cell biology, neuroscience related, and working as a patient transporter is not as specific as you might, or you can't easily align it to. But I think it was meaningful enough to me that I could say hey, I really enjoyed this experience, and I really enjoyed interacting with patients. And I did it for quite a significant amount of time that I was able to say I really wanted to go back into that clinical environment. And I think it's not so clinical in that I was involved with patient interaction, but I did shadow, and I did shadow, I think, an MD-PhD, who was a neuropathologist, and that was more sort of related to my clinical interests, although I didn't, wasn't interacting with patients or anything, but just watching him and kind of seeing the work-life balance that he had and what he did on a daily basis, that was sort of a way for me to tie in that I wanted to pursue, something related to the MD-PhD path a little bit.
How much did they, sort of a related question, how much were you asked on the interview trail about the career of MD-PhDs and how much you knew about it? How did you know? I guess I always worried as a director, did applicants really know what they were getting into? How much did they really get it? Is it possible to be a physician, a scientist? And you mentioned work-life balance, Tara. I mean, did that come up?
For me, I think it came up almost in every single interview. I mean, you had the question why MD-PhD? I think that's what they wanted to know the most. But there were some interviews that I think they definitely said how do you know that you're able to handle multitask? What's an example that you were able to did you problem solve your way through something, or can you give an example of how you overcame a challenge, or how do you face criticism, things like that came up on the MD-PhD side of things that I think sort of related to that.
So over the years, I've found that if there's a weakness, and there isn't really a weakness with Hopkins applicants, but when I see them junior, senior year, sometimes there'll be some folks that they haven't had the good fortune of working in a lab where the PI is a physician scientist, and let's say they've been in a lab. I think, by the way, Tara, I think the design team stuff is great for the BMEs. I think that, and I've seen that as being a great way to tie together. You're sort of functioning as a physician scientist in that setting at that time. That's a great opportunity. But for those that don't have that, aren't working with a PI, sometimes they haven't had that experience of talking to physician scientists, shadowing them. So did you find that was having those experiences you could talk about, think about, draw inferences from were valuable in terms of addressing those kind of questions?
Yeah, I definitely think that was an invaluable experience because it's very much, I mean, engineering inherently is very investigative problem solving, kind of similar to the research mindset, and then applying it to the clinical settings. And we had to do research even on the greater healthcare system of the specific ailment we were looking at. And so that was yeah, it was a great kind of dip in the pool of physician investigator. And so that was great. But I also to interview question came up a couple of times for me. I don't know if it came up quite as common as much as it did for Sarah, but she did more MD-PhD interviews. So I just had over the summer I did a research internship at Weill Cornell, and my supervisor there was an MD-PhD. He was an anesthesiologist who also worked in a neuroscience lab. And so I usually talked about my experience with him and kind of the double life that he lived that I didn't really know was possible, because that's what I didn't get exposure to before, was necessarily that there are people who literally spend half of their week in the lab and half of their week in the clinic.
Yeah.
And that was a great way for me to get exposed.
I think having those role models and those experiences are critical. So those of you that will be applying, if you haven't had that experience yet, please go out and get it. And one of the questions is, how do you do that? And when is Andrea Cox coming again? Monday?
2 Mondays from now, April 10th.
April 10th. So, the MSTP director from Hopkins will be there giving a talk to the undergrads. And I would encourage any of you that feel like, well, gee, I haven't had that experience of talking with physicians, shadowing them, seeing how they divide their day. Talk to her, and she would be able to point you towards some of the folks down at the hospital or in Bayview that would provide you with that. I think it's so valuable, so critical to be a competitive applicant and have great grades, have all this research, but if you don't have a clue about what this career is about and how you can pull it all together, it doesn't help you.
Was there an interview question that you felt like stumped either of you during your process, or one that sticks out in the back of your head like, I hated that question, or I'll never forget that question? Or maybe not.
There was one, it was a very, there's one that sticks out in my mind because I think that it was a bit unprofessional. That I had an interviewer ask me, there was some personal details in my personal statement that I kind of just used for narrative purposes, but then they were kind of asking me, like drilling me more about that experience and like how it is still, how like I'm coping and how that still affected me, which I had like explained in my personal statement like how I overcame it, and that was it. It was just the way it was framed seemed a bit inappropriate, but
Yeah.
I will mention the personal statements, anything in a sense is fair game. And so just to keep in mind, many years ago, when I first started helping out at Hopkins, there was a young woman who was a very strong applicant, ended up getting into a really great program, but in the process, she wrote in her personal statement, she had a lot of issues in her life, and there were so many, and she overcame so many things, but she also talked about both she and her sister were sexually abused as children by their stepfather. And on top of everything else at this one, I said to her, well, I get it. And that's why she started a women's support group at Hopkins. I get all that. But I said, keep in mind, if you put that in the essay, you're going to have to talk about this about 25 times. And is that really what you want to do? You want to have every time dredging up everything? And so we decided together that, she really didn't want to do that. It made her a powerful person, but there were so many other things that she did that we didn't have to do this. So keep in mind, anything in the personal statement is discussable. But on the other hand, if it's something in a private letter, so let's say you didn't put this in your essay that you were sexual, but one of your like your PI knows you really well, might mention it in their letter that you can't bring that up in the interview, because that's confidential information. I used to tell my admissions committee, the letters are private and you cannot, other than just sort of things that are brought up in their essays, discuss it. If it's not in there, then you can't bring it up. But keep that in mind, your personal statement is personal and they will ask you all kind of stuff about it, right? Turn it around and try to see, right?
I guess on my interview trail, I didn't really have like any question, questions that were too like tough to answer. I think there was one question though that was quite interesting, was describe like your most significant research finding in like 5 to 10 words, which was something to think about for a while. But yeah, I think it was just a sort of introduction, just to get to know you. But
What resources did you all use to prep for your interviews?
I used the Hopkins mock interview. So yeah, I met with one of the alumni. That was great. I also just read through like advice forums and talked to people who I know had gone through it and got their advice.
yeah, that's the same thing that I also did. And then also just making sure that I kind of knew my research inside out. Anything that I put on my significant research experiences, like I made sure to cover all the details.
Yeah, something that is really good to do, I think, is practice explaining your research to somebody else.
Yeah.
And I did that in my mock interview. But there was one interview where they pretty much had me give a like chalk talk. And so that was something that I did have to like prep for because I had never I'd done slide decks and poster presentations, but that was just something to keep in mind.
But they told you that ahead of time.
Yes, yeah.
That's good, because otherwise, if you hadn't prepared and they say, go do this, that.
I don't have any questions in the chat right now. Does anyone want to unmute themselves, ask a question? We have about 5 minutes left. What's one piece of advice that you would give applicants moving forward? Or two pieces, all the pieces.
I guess I could start. I think, there's a lot of waiting and a lot of uncertainty about the process. I mean, waiting, first you submit your primary and then, you're waiting for the secondaries and then you submit those and then you're waiting for interviews. And I think, and then you also submit those or you do those and you're waiting for the responses. So I think just making sure like you keep yourself busy a little bit, like you're not too like focused all the time about, where am I going to get in? What am I going to do? Like, where am I going to end up? I think just having like a little bit of a break, take it easy a little bit, have a hobby. I was kind of lucky that I had classes during that time, so I could kind of focus a little bit on classes. But yeah, just taking a little bit of time for yourself.
Yeah, my advice is similar. I don't know if I think like it's my biggest advice, I guess, is like not to take it too personally, but it's kind of hard because you put like everything, like you put your heart and soul into the application. At least I did because like it's weighted a lot. But like you can't if it can be there's ups and downs to the process and the goods and the wait, like the goods and the bads and the like waiting, it can kind of drive you crazy. So
Oh, okay, we have questions coming in. Did you have anyone look over your primary apps before submitting? If so, who?
I think by like primary apps, they probably just mean like my MD-PhD interest statement and my personal statement.
Yeah, or maybe if you got work and activities looked at either, or yeah.
Yeah, so I had some of my recommendation letter writers, like previous PIs and doctors I had worked with. They read my personal statement and some of them read my MD-PhD letter. And I also had some close friends read it, either if they had applied in the past or had significant science background, or if I had some friends that were very heavily writing, and so like they just pretty much helped me with like the semantics of my writing. Yeah.
Yeah, I was also similar. I think I would echo or stress the point about like having your significant research experiences like read by like a PI or somebody like that, so they can really like make sure that you got the science, correct and down. So yeah, and then I also had my parents, my family read it. I think one thing is like you don't want too many people to read it because they might give you like differing opinions. So I think just people that you trust.
Yeah. This next question might be for Dr. Rogers actually. So what if there are less than 10 to 15 schools that meet my specific research area? Should I frame my research interest so that it opens up my chance to get interviews at schools that may not have PIs in this very specific field, but in broader areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if it's a very narrow area, that can be good and bad for just the reasons you said. If you're a perfect match for these 10 or 15 schools, that's great, and they're going to want you, and they're going to recruit you, and that's terrific. But then you worry that, well, am I just going to be limited? So possibly you could, expand it a little bit. So I don't know what particular area we're talking about, but you might be able to craft it so that you're open to variations on a central theme. And I think that is totally appropriate because we used to talk about applicants who were fully differentiated applicants in terms of their research interests and those that were more broad. Like neuroscience is a very broad field, and some people are interested in like cognitive neuroscience, or they want to do genetics neuroscience, they want to do electrophysiology and quantitative neural networking, for example, doing computer engineering in the brain. So that, neuroscience is a broad area. And so if somebody's only doing, let's say, quantitative computer engineering in the brain, you might broaden that out a little bit to say you'd be interested in some behavioral quantitative analyses applied to behavioral work, something like that, just to give you some other schools that may actually be interesting, because you may change your focus a little bit along the way. You may enter fully differentiated, but something in medical school turns you on. You never thought about immunology, you never had it before, and suddenly there's this whole field of immunology out there, and you may want to change. So, I would focus on your strengths, apply to those schools, but broaden it out a little bit so you can maybe have another 5, 10 schools that would be interesting for you.
Any insight? Oh, am I muted? Okay. Any insight on the MD-PhD programs in humanities? Are the interviews similar to STEM ones, Dr. Rogers?
Yeah, I haven't had a lot of experience with those, but in those particular areas, you really need to have a strong rationale for why you want to get that degree in the humanities, your own background, for example, but also then a pretty clear idea what you're going to do with it as a physician. And so that's the only thing I would say. I know there are a lot of schools, or not a lot of schools, that offer these kinds of humanity PhDs, but if you've got an idea, you've got some examples of people that have combined them in a compelling way, whether it's history in medicine or economics in medicine, those are all very, very real possibilities. You just need to make sure, A, you're prepared to embark on a PhD in economics or history. If you've been a computer engineering major, you may not be such a great history PhD student, number one. And then number two, have some idea, what are you going to do with all this training? I mean, you don't want to be a dysfunctionally trained person who isn't prepared to really do anything useful out there. And so that's the only proviso I would say there.
Great.
Yeah, during the application process, I didn't look into these programs heavily, and everything Dr. Rogers said is correct. There's not very many of them, but some of them also, just forewarning, require like either a master's in the specific field or an undergrad, obviously in a related field. Which for me was just, I have an undergrad in engineering and I don't have a master's. So even though I was like interested in bioethics, not that I would have been a good applicant anyway, but like I couldn't have even matriculated. So that's something to consider, as well as sometimes there's additional qualifications for those programs.
I know we're out of time, but I have a quick question. When you were applying to these MD, PhD, and MD programs, we talked a little bit in our small groups on Tuesday about how sometimes you apply to the grad school, sometimes you apply to the MD and then the MD PhD. So how did you both navigate the intricacies of each school and what that looked like, or was it streamlined?
And how different were they?
Right.
I think at least in my experience, I think it was like you apply like to the MD-PhD program. It seemed pretty streamlined for most schools. But there were some schools that, there was like, apply to the PhD program or MD program first, and then you see what happens with the PhD program. I think for those cases, I think that you just have to be really organized yourself. I think having like an Excel sheet or something where you like keep track of like the dates when things are due, or when how your application is, or what stage you are at in that school, I think is pretty key. But for the most part, at least for me, I think it was pretty streamlined.
Mhm.
Yeah, my experience is very similar, that a lot of them kind of combined the MD essays and PhD essays into at least one like hub, so that it would have a different tab indicating that these were, the PhD essays, more research focused. But at least I could keep track on that one page how far I had gotten.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, any last tidbits or tips or words of advice for our people here today before we wrap up?
Do your secondaries early.
Yeah, definitely
2
pre-write
weeks.
if you can.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Takes a lot of
pre-write.
time. They're not all the same like the primary, right?
Yeah, that's dedicate a large side of time for your secondaries, pre-write them, and even if you can find like pre-writing, obviously, like you find the prompts beforehand, or at least like have some generalized essays already done. That's my biggest advice.
I would say the same thing, and then just take care of yourself throughout the process. A lot of ups and downs, so yeah, take it easy.
Yeah, mental health, have an outlet, right? Absolutely. Awesome. Well, Dr. Rogers, any last minute things?
No, I look forward to reading some essays and helping out this spring. So anyone who hasn't signed up for the small groups, I don't know if there are any more spots for next week, but we have some spots available, I think.
Yep, there are. Yep. So we have some spots for the freshman, sophomore, and junior, senior alumni sessions. So small groups, and then sign up for the session with Andrea Cox on April 10th.
Right. Well, good luck to Tara and to Sarah. Thank you for helping out today, lending your
Thank you so much.
wisdom.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Of course. Enjoy your rest of your weeks and your weekends, and we will be talking to you guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.